Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to say hello to everyone and thank for joining us this morning. We have a very special guest speaker this morning. I'm sure Dr. John will introduce her in a minute. But you know, I first met her some 30 years ago when she was very charming young reporter. She still is. Reporter for very influential magazine, as you know, the Institutional Investor. She was very well-known young reporter then. So actually, I borrowed 2 copies of what she wrote about me then. I was a Minister of Finance then, and she said many nice things about me, so I was always thankful. But anyway, somehow, since then, we haven't met more frequently. But I'm so glad to see her here this morning. Just exactly the same as she was 30 years ago.
Still learning from you.
Still very attractive and young and stimulating. Well, I'm so glad to have sent Henny here this morning. I'm really looking forward to sharing your insights and views. Thank you very much again joining us this morning. Please join me in welcoming Henny, please. Okay, Henny.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Sagong, for your kind introduction this morning. Well, today we are most fortunate to have an outstanding journalist, Dr. Henny Sender, as our special guest speaker to talk about a very timely topic on China's economy. As you know, there are a lot of talks about a slowdown in China's economy, along with housing bubble, debt crisis, and the structural weakness. Not to mention ongoing trade dispute between the United States and China. I'm very confident that Henny's insightful views will help us understand this very complex issue in a very comprehensive and longer-term context. Now I would like to quickly introduce Henny Sender, is a close friend of mine for years. Now Henny is the chief correspondent for international finance at FT, Financial Times, based in New York and Hong Kong, contributing immensely to the global reputation of FT. Prior to joining FT, Henny worked for Wall Street Journal for some 10 years as a senior special writer covering private equity and hedge fund, for which she won the very prestigious Loeb Award, probably the most distinguished award as a journalist. Henny's career also covers her active role at the Far Eastern Economic Review and Institutional Investor that Dr. Sagong mentioned just before. She holds graduate degrees from Columbia University. Now with that, let's welcome Doctor, should I say doctor? We're rather awkward here, but anyway, she's doctor, so Dr. Henny Sender. She will speak for about 40 minutes, followed 30 minutes or so, followed by about the same amount of time for Q&As. Okay, floor is yours, Henny.
Thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be back in Korea. Actually, I was in Beijing on March 23rd last year, Asian time. And that was an interesting day because that was the day that Beijing government was expected to approve of the takeover of Toshiba's chip business by Hynix and Bain Capital. But in Washington, it was March 22nd, and that was the day that Trump announced the trade war. And at the time, no one thought just how big an impact the trade war would have. And of course, it was impossible for Beijing to approve of that sale that day. But in May, that Toshiba sale to Hynix and Bain Capital was approved. And it says so much that China actually controls the fate of international mergers and acquisitions because of the power of its market. It would have been a killer if it hadn't. And one of the conditions that Beijing imposed on that deal was to say Hynix cannot cut the supply of chips to Chinese customers such as Huawei. And in retrospect, I think that says so much about China's strengths and weaknesses. The power of its market enables China to impose conditions, but at the same time, the Beijing government knows exactly where its vulnerabilities are. And Korea and Japan will play pivotal roles as China tries to court them and their higher technology to compensate for the fact that they will have a much harder time getting technology from the US. I have spent most of my career in Asia watching the rise of China, and although I come from New York, I feel like I don't see China through American eyes. And that's because when I was studying Chinese in university in the States, it was very difficult to go to the mainland. And my professor said, well, why don't you go to India instead? So, fine, that sounded like a great idea to me. And, you know, when you were saying 3 decades and nothing has changed, when I was a student in India, the average speed of a train was 25 kilometers an hour. Today, it's 24 kilometers an hour. So in some places, nothing changed, including us. But because I see China through Indian eyes to some extent, I can appreciate how far China has come. And when Indians ask me, what do Chinese think about India? I have 2 answers. One is they don't think much about India because they're looking forward and they see Japan, they see Korea, they see the US. They don't look behind. That's semi-diplomatic. The even less diplomatic answer is that Chinese people who go to India invariably say, nothing makes us more proud to be Chinese than to go to India. But I have seen the rise of China, and while I will talk about the risks, I see that China's economy has improved in the quality of its growth over that time. So there are lots of times when I get on the phone to the editors in London about headlines in the FT and on the front page of the FT. And after the fourth quarter of last year, we had big headlines saying Chinese growth slowest in 2 decades. I thought that was a big mistake because the base is so huge. Growing 6% is quite remarkable because the base is so large. And at the same time, the quality of growth has improved enormously in China. And technology is changing the landscape and changing the ways that we think about competitive advantage. And this is why I love being in Asia, because you're seeing the trends that will shape the rest of the world take place in this part of Asia. And it will pose great challenges for other countries in the area. And every country in the world, to some extent, will either be the beneficiary or the victim of the sparring between China and the US. And the other point that I thought the FT didn't focus on enough is GDP is talked about as an end in itself. Actually, Chinese people don't think that much about GDP. They think about job growth. And to me, China's job growth is one of the reasons for optimism. Last year, China created 11 million jobs. By contrast, can anyone guess how many jobs India created last year? Or say the last 5 years? Well, you're right not to raise your hands because until last week or the week before, India didn't give out data on job creation because the data was so wrong. And that gets me to one of the most important switches that people always, including Indians, talk about the demographic dividend of having a young population. But if there's no job growth, that demographic dividend is a curse. China can afford to leave behind low-end manufacturing because it doesn't have the pressures of 1 million younger people coming onto the job market every year the way India does. There's virtually no job growth in India. And the most intractable question that I ask government people in India is, where are jobs going to come from in the future? And the answer is deeply concerning to me. And I was talking to one economist, and his answer was 150 million rich Indians will each support 10 families, not 10 people, 10 families. So if your driver's dad gets cancer in the village, you will bring that guy to Mumbai and see and pay for his medicines. If your gardener's kid needs help with English lessons, you'll help with that. And in return, your servants will not slit your throat while you're sleeping every night in your bedroom behind a gate, the way you see in South Africa, for example. And this is a very dystopian view of the future where many people have no prospects of social mobility. And, you know, it's very counterintuitive, but Japan, Korea, China have gotten richer before they got older, and that takes the pressure off. But India, there's only low-end service jobs. And the Financial Times has a driver in India, and he came from the worst part of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, in the Hindu heartland, and he came to Mumbai. And he's kind of disappointed with his life as a driver, but I used to say to him, your kids will have a better life because you came here. But my concern is by the time his kids graduate from high school or junior college, the sort of back-end office jobs that they used to think they would get, understanding computers, speaking English, are all going to be done by AI. And India has no chance to be the manufacturing powerhouse. It's too late. You know, you don't have the infrastructure in India. So I see that so many of you are in Vietnam, in Bangladesh. To me, these are the countries that will benefit as China moves up the value-added curve. And of course, because labor costs are rising in China, you have the danger of markets like the US being closed. You know, everyone says, well, China is doomed. But to me, China's economy has already undergone significant structural changes. Technology has changed the landscape. China will become much more domestically driven. In 2007, China had a current account surplus of 9.9% of GDP. In 2018, that current account surplus was 0.5% of GDP. And in 2019, for the first time for the entire year, it will probably be negative. It will go from being a capital exporter to a capital importer. And it is going from manufacturing to services. One of the risks that people always talk about is inflation. But I think that they underestimate the importance of the transformation of the economy. So I spent a lot of time thinking about the car industry. Last year, for the first time in 2 decades, people bought fewer cars in China than the year before. And many people said, oh, this is the slowing economy, this is a cyclical thing, but it's also a secular change. And I think it's a really important one. And because Korea is such a successful car maker, I wonder if you see that the future of cars will be completely different, on a completely different trajectory than it has been up to now. To me, the sharing economy is essentially deflationary. Cars are going from being a thing that people buy to being a service that people share. So, you know, there was a very interesting Goldman Sachs report about demand for cars in China, you know, and they entitled it Not Yet 2019, meaning that demand for cars will not pick up to the level of 2017 for another 3 or 4 years. But I think you might be in a world where it will never pick up, especially in big cities. It's already very hard to own a car in places like Shanghai and Beijing. The traffic is so congested, you cannot drive a car on many days. You know, it's odd license plate, even license plate. And even, you know, the new coming of electric vehicles will not lead to the kind of demands that we had seen earlier. I don't know a single millennial in China that wants to own a car. This is a huge shift. The growth in China going forward will be much more services driven than making things. And that means that the kind of jobs will shift, and there's also less pressure. I was shocked to learn you were vastly better off working in the logistics field, delivering packages, than you would have been a few years working in a low-end textile plant or across the border in Dongguan or something like that. You're already seeing massive upgrading of services, consumption, I learned last night that more Koreans visit Japan than Chinese, but it's amazing to go wherever you go in the world today, you will see Chinese tourists. And, China has had a deficit on its tourism account for many years now. And Chinese people used to complain bitterly to me, oh, the U.S. is always complaining about the fact that we keep the renminbi cheap, but never gives Japan a hard time about the yen. And then Chinese people realize, well, we might as well be the beneficiaries of cheap yen. We'll go to Japan. So it's very interesting to me. And most people don't realize that actually China is looking inward already. It's far less connected with the world through trade, etc., now than it was just a few years ago. And the companies I visit these days in China tend to be what I think of as this third generation of tech companies. So I spend a lot of time with the Chinese venture capital firms, and I see the third generation of companies. And, the first generation was the Alibabas of the world, the Tencents of the world. Then we have, the consumer internet companies like Meituan, which is food delivery and, has replaced Ctrip as the most successful travel app. But the third generation is amazing. And I visited one of the Sequoia companies that's in artificial intelligence. And the founder of this firm, which is called 4Paradigm, Dai Wenyuan, is completely homegrown Chinese. And this guy came from Shandong. He ended up working for Baidu in their AI. He was convinced that Baidu, which of course is the Chinese equivalent of Google, was not serious enough about AI. So he formed his own company, his own AI company, 4 years ago, when he was 28. And he went to Silicon Valley for the first time last summer. And he said to me, we've already leapfrogged Silicon Valley, and we work so much harder than they do. I have nothing to learn from Silicon Valley. And he was kind of shocked and disappointed. And when he started out in AI, he was applying it mostly to fintech, but now he's in life sciences. And he's working closely with Chinese universities and Chinese hospitals for early detection of kidney disease and cancers, and hopefully using AI to come up with cures as well through big data. And I see this kind of transformation in so many areas of China. And there is a sort of dark underside to this, because what makes Chinese companies have an advantage in life sciences is big data. And China has data on all its people, and there's ready access to it. So the underside of that is that there's a lot of concerns about privacy issues, about clinical trials with human subjects that don't have enough controls. But the fact is, if you believe, as many scientists do in China, that the next generation of discoverers will be from AI, you have to say that they will be a leader very soon. And if you look at the data, 3 years ago, for example, every licensing agreement between Chinese pharma companies and US pharma companies, it was all one way. China importing the right to sell US drugs in China. 2 years ago, it began to be two ways. And there was something, according to one of the research reports I saw from a local Chinese research arm of a startup bank. It was 27 licenses going to China, but 4 or 5 going back. And you will see more and more of this. I don't want to give the impression that China doesn't have significant vulnerabilities. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about the risks that I see and the vulnerabilities that I see. I don't worry as much about a debt crisis in China as many other people do. Many people have said no country has ever grown its debt to GDP as rapidly as China has and not had a debt crisis. But the structure of the Chinese economy is different. First of all, you have $3 trillion in reserves, a figure that has stabilized. Secondly, you do have state-owned banks that are funded by deposits, and those deposits are fairly sticky. You know, if I ask myself why what started out as an American financial crisis was transmitted so quickly to Europe, it was because of the vulnerability of banks that relied on wholesale funding. And when they could not fund themselves anymore, the crisis quickly went to Europe and then to the rest of the world. I just don't see that happening in China. And you have seen that corporate debt, which is 160% of GDP, has stopped growing. It hasn't gone down, but it's stopped growing. Recently, China has switched from deleveraging to releveraging its economy, but it has controlled the shadow banks, and the tech companies are helping in a major way to support lending to the SMEs and the households that are more productive. There's some people who are starting to worry about household debt in relationship to GDP because household debt has grown very, very quickly. But over half that debt is mortgage debt. So I don't see that as much of a problem. So to me, when I ask what are the risks that I worry about, it's basically much more political. So Chinese people, for many of the Chinese people I talk to, the friction with the US and China is more a symptom of something else than a cause. And especially the elite of China have totally lost faith in their own government. And you know, when Xi Jinping first came to power, many people hoped and believed that he would be another Deng Xiaoping. But most people in China believe that rather than becoming another Deng Xiaoping, he is more like a Mao Zedong. And my generation, which is the Cultural Revolution generation, became very alarmed when term limits were abolished in China. And it just brought back memories of the Cultural Revolution, which was a disaster. And so you have a kind of ironic situation where I said, well, China's worst enemy in the short term will be its best friend in the long term. And that is because Xi Jinping has concentrated so much power and has totally undermined the case for Chinese reformers to change China. Many of those same reformers believe that the reforms that President Trump is insisting on will prove beneficial to China in the long run. Things like reducing subsidies to state-owned enterprises, things like demanding intellectual property rights are all in China's long-term interest. And that is why they believe while in the short run, Trump is definitely our worst enemy, in the long term, he will prove to be the best friend of China, because China needs all these reforms, and they can't come from within today because Xi Jinping has become so heavy-handed, especially in regard to privately owned enterprises, which generate 60 to 70% of all jobs in China today. And although recently you've heard a lot of lip service from the government and Li Keqiang in particular, trying to reassure the private sector, people do not feel secure. And although we've seen since 2015 that there's no talk about liberalizing the renminbi further on the capital account, we still see every quarter since 2016 the errors and omissions of the balance of payments. The errors and omissions is almost 50 billion every quarter. So nothing like the kind of loss of reserves we saw in 2015, but it's still an issue. And we have seen so many policy missteps. So, it started with Make in China 2025, which was, of course, the blueprint of the industries that would get support from the government, and it ranged from industrial robots to renewable energy to electric vehicles, all these kinds of semiconductors, all these kinds of things. It was meant to, no one thought about it much at the time, but instead it was like raising a red flag to the American bulls. They clearly saw China challenging the technological lead of the US. The US doesn't have a national champion for 5G, which is, of course, the next technology for the next era. Huawei is that for China. And so it's no accident to me that the US has identified Huawei as a huge target. The national security law that China passed in 2017 says that any company in China has to cooperate with Beijing. You have to comply with what Beijing asks for. So Huawei cannot say what its chairman insists. Oh, we will always say no to requests from Beijing. They can't say that. It's against that law. Many people in China say, why would China do this? These are Chinese people saying this. By saying that, China is saying there's no such thing as a truly private enterprise in China. The US, interestingly enough, has tried to do exactly what it accuses Beijing of doing. It has said to its Apples, etc., we want a back door. And Apple says, sorry, we won't give that to you. So the US is somewhat hypocritical, but American companies can say no to the US government in a way that China can't. So that is one of the biggest risks that I worry about facing China. I think there are other risks, obviously. People keep asking me about social stability, but actually the opposition to Xi Jinping isn't widespread. Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious. Xi Jinping says, to get rich means you must be corrupt. And there has been so much corruption in China. Xi Jinping still has a lot of support from ordinary Chinese. So I don't see social stability as a risk. And the elite that is the most disaffected by him, the ones who are taking capital out of China, are too weak these days to be an effective opposition to him. But I was talking to one of the private equity firms, and one of their pitches to companies in China about why they should sell is, we will pay you offshore. So this is a very seductive promise. You can get your money out of China. I know many Chinese who could move tomorrow to the US or other countries because they already have everything in place if they think, they will be the next target. So, this is a country in a very interesting situation where the wealthy business community has totally lost faith with the government. There's one other challenge that I see, even as I talk about how China is successfully moving up the value-added curve, and that is education. China needs to reform its educational system, which includes the worst elements of traditional Confucian memorization, but also party loyalty. So I don't know if any of you have heard the name of Dr. Zhang Shucheng. This is one of the most brilliant scientists that China has ever produced. I met him at Stanford some years ago. He was from Shanghai originally. He went to Fudan. After Fudan, and he went to Fudan when he was 16. After he graduated, he was told to learn German. He was given 6 months to do so. Then he got his PhD in theoretical physics in 2 years in Berlin. And I asked him, why did you leave China and come to the US? And he said, I could never get research grants in China because I'm considered insufficiently loyal to the party. The reason I mention him is on December 1st, he committed suicide. The rumor is, obviously he was depressed, but if you look on WeChat, and many people believe these accounts on WeChat are accurate, he was accused of being a spy by the FBI. It is such a sad story, but it has the effect of making many Chinese people feel we're not welcome in the States. If this guy, who is widely believed by both Chinese and Americans to be one day the winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics, and he didn't have any immunity, then what does it say about us? And already so many of the Chinese scientists who have gone to the States are coming back to China now because they don't feel welcome. And I met one returnee recently in Beijing, and he has 2 name cards. And one is of his startup, which is listed on NASDAQ and was listed in Hong Kong a few months ago. And the other is as the director of an Institute of Life Sciences in Beijing, which of course is government owned. And the last thing he said to me after I met him is, if you ever have problems with the internet in China, Henny, you just call me, because we have no firewalls here. You come here and you can work and access anything on the internet you want. So China is slowly learning what it needs to create real innovation. You cannot have firewalls. This guy has a research budget that is almost unlimited. Anything he wants, he can get. Most party members, whether they're in government or in the state-owned enterprises, do not have free movement in China. You can usually only leave the country twice a year, and then for no more than a week at a time. He can go to any conference anywhere in the world with no limits, because China understands that it needs to give those scientists a kind of freedom. But for China to really put innovation on a firm foundation, it needs to change its educational institutions. It needs to release the grip of the party. If you are the president of a university in China, you have to have the status of vice minister. That's how loyal to the party you need to be. And that's what I see as one of the big risks. Before I stop talking and we have more of a debate, because I always think journalists should be asking questions more than answering them, as I unsuccessfully pointed out to Dr. Jun, I want to talk about, what it means for the rest of the world. All of you are at ground zero as potential collateral damage in the fighting between the U.S. and China. Ultimately, it's going to lead to a much less stable world. Yesterday, Dr. Jun and I had lunch with somebody from Singapore, formerly with GIC. And, Singapore, as a small city-state, has tried desperately to be friends with both China and the U.S. And last year I was at a conference in China, and the Prime Minister of Singapore was speaking about the necessity to preserve the world trading order and how the way to resolve disputes has to be multilateral. It cannot be bilateral, which obviously was seen as an attack on Trump's very adversarial and aggressive approach to the dispute with China. But not long before that, Singapore, as you know, like Korea, has a draft. And every year, Singapore Army recruits tend to have wartime exercises in Taiwan. And this has been going on for years. They ship equipment through Hong Kong. Beijing seized all that equipment in between Taiwan and Singapore with the messages, you have to choose. You can't be friends with both of us. But when the Prime Minister went to the U.S., and you watched his face in the press meetings after his meeting with Trump, he's clearly terrified. The U.S. cannot be considered a reliable ally anymore by many people as long as Trump is president. And, I don't know if you agree with this, but every time I see pictures of Prime Minister Abe with Prime Minister Putin, to me the message is the U.S. is not a reliable ally. We need other friends in the world. It's especially challenging for Korea. One of the many mistakes that the regime in Beijing made was in response to the THAAD missiles. I don't know if anyone is here from Lotte, but, this message that Beijing took and said, we don't believe this is about North Korea. We believe this is about us. We don't want tourists coming to Korea. And we especially want you all to boycott Lotte because they supplied the land for these things. This is a very poor response from China. It makes China look as vindictive as the U.S. these days. I have to say that one of the things that I think is most impressive about Korea is when I travel in other countries, I see how successful Korea is at localizing compared to many other countries. So I still spend a lot of time in India, and many years ago I was talking to Hyundai people, and Hyundai went from nothing in the Indian car market to the second biggest market share against Maruti Suzuki, with all the support that Maruti Suzuki receives from the government of India. And they had just hired a head of marketing from Tata Motors. And it was just at the time when Indian middle-class people began to aspire to owning a car and upgrading from motorcycles. And Hyundai had one of the most successful advertising campaigns, in the history of the country, promoting Hyundai cars as the dowry gift of choice. And it was so successful that this local Indian from Tata was actually made president of Hyundai. And you don't see that kind of very successful localization from many other countries. At one point, Samsung refrigerators, as I was telling you yesterday, were the most successful refrigerator sales in India because the local people said to Samsung, if a housewife is wealthy enough to afford a refrigerator in India, she's wealthy enough to have a lot of servants. If you put a lock on the door of that refrigerator, she controls who has access to food. It's so mean. None of us would ever think of it to put a lock on the door of our refrigerators, but it was hugely successful in India, and everyone soon copied it. So it wasn't a lasting barrier to entry, but it worked, and it told you so much about how flexible Koreans are in finding such wonderful talent to make Korea's companies successful in India. You can see how successful is Samsung, for example, in Vietnam. Korean companies have increased their foreign direct investment in Vietnam by a factor of 3 in the last 10 years. I'm planning my first trip to Bangladesh because so many Korean companies have started going to Bangladesh as well. I think you're all so fortunate, but other countries are going to be less fortunate when it comes to collateral damage. Many of you are here from the World Bank. I spend a lot of time in Pakistan. I find Pakistan very frightening because I think Pakistan may well be the first country in the world to run out of water. The IFC arm of the World Bank is working with the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank on several hydro projects in Pakistan. If Pakistan runs out of water, it's a disaster for India, a close ally of the US. And yet, every other day, IFC people tell me about the fact that the US is saying to them, we don't want you to work with China, and we certainly don't want you to work in Pakistan. And we've already seen the US Secretary of State saying we oppose an IMF package to Pakistan because we think it benefits the Chinese. The first thing that happened after he said that was that Imran Khan got on a plane and went to Riyadh in search of money. Well, Riyadh has an unfortunate habit of saying, we'll give you money, we'll build mosques for you, we'll build madrasa for you, and we will choose the imam who will preach the worst kind of intolerant Islam. So these are kind of the unintended consequences of American policies, which I do think will destabilize many countries in the world. So I try not to end on a bearish note, but I can't help it. Please forgive me if I've offended any of you, and let's now have a debate about how wrong you think I am. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henny, for your excellent speech and exceptional insights based on real stories. I would like to open the floor for questions and Henny's response. Could you? Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Sender, for your very illuminating talk, pointing out both the challenges as well as the opportunities of China very well. But I want to change the dimension slightly differently. I thought the worst enemy of China, maybe enemy is a too strong a word, but challenge, is its sheer size. Not necessarily what is going on, but how to rule that huge amount of a country effectively is the big question. And Xi Jinping is doing a very good job. But the problem is that is the very successful way of doing the short term, but that cannot be sustained eternally. Because no very strong, powerful one-man rule, which requires incredible amount of the talents combined in one man, you cannot always find the successor as effectively. And how do you solve that problem is China's real problem. The more he concentrated his power in his own rule, once he leaves, how the country can continue to be effectively ruled is the question. How do you see that part of the world, not just the economy side?
I have a very dark view on that. I think that technology will change the whole structure of command and control. And with technology and the surveillance, and big data, you're looking at a society that has actually much less freedom, which technology enables. Everyone thought 20 years ago that China would follow Taiwan's path, right? Which started as a military dictatorship under, after 1949 and evolved into a democracy. I think precisely because of the reach of technology and the way it is being applied in China, that it will be possible to keep much more control over this huge country with its population, even though that population will shrink. But the quality of governance, I totally agree with you, is a problem. And even the quality of party members, is declining. More and more people say, I don't want to be a member of the party. I often used to wonder, if I was born in China, would I have chosen to become a member of the party? And more people in China are saying it's not worth the price. So the quality of governance will go down, but I don't think the control necessarily has to. What do you think, Dr. Chen?
It's for you to respond. Then our audience is not interested in my response. Is that okay? Any other questions? Oh, okay, please, Professor Chai.
Well, thank you very much. After listening from you for a while, I'm still not convinced why you titled "Why I Remain Optimistic About China." What I heard from you is why I remain optimistic about China's Communist Party, not about Chinese economy, Chinese people. Because throughout your talk, I was not convinced why what's the enemy short run is going to prove best friend in long term. Because as you mentioned, in the light of ongoing tectonic paradigm shift between two biggest countries in the world, changing from strategic cooperation to strategic competition, so-called, the China and U.S., they decide to navigate new relationship for the future. Then, do you still believe the future Chinese economy is going to be optimistic, given their nature? For instance, all these AIs and 5Gs and so-called digital transformation will require access to and use of global talent and global resources. But U.S. seems to me determined to terminate and isolate, contain China's access to U.S. education market and talent pool and R&D and so on. But still, China is going to be successful. And what I see is instead reverse of Frankenstein economy, what George Orwellian big state controlling people's life. And do you believe there will be a second moment of Tiananmen Square in China? And what China Communist Party will do with it?
I think I do see so much value added in China and how quickly it has moved up the value chain. And precisely because it's shifting to more domestic demand-led and service-led, I do think that it will succeed in moving up the value chain, and that it's too late for the U.S. to put China in a box as it wishes to. And, I do think that there are other sources of technology. And even though the U.S. will be closed, China does have other alternatives. So, for example, China has become very close to Israel. And in a world where everything is dual-use technology, you know, Israel is a pioneer. So for example, Israeli engineers are working with Chinese autonomous vehicle companies with technology to prevent their hacking. And this technology was originally developed by Israel so that its tanks couldn't be hijacked or hacked. So, you know, one of the things the US is doing is leaning on Israel, saying, we don't want you to help China anymore. But these are, in many cases, individuals, not companies. So, for example, let me take the example of drones. So, at the same time that I'm more optimistic about China, I'll tell you why I'm more pessimistic about the US. And one of the big reasons is, once again, in a world where everything is dual-use technology, civilian and military, the amazingly productive relationship that you saw between the Department of Defense and the companies of Silicon Valley and leading research institutions like MIT and Stanford has completely broken down. And when Obama was president, Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, hired a guy who would try to heal this relationship. And I first met him at a Council of Foreign Relations event. And this guy described to me how he would visit Silicon Valley, and the Silicon Valley companies would all say to him, would you mind not signing our guest book? And this relationship has totally broken down. In the 1990s, Jim Wolseley was then running the CIA, and he became concerned that the US had fallen well behind in drone technology. And he reached out to the Pentagon, and he said to the Pentagon, how much will it cost and how long will it take to develop an effective drone program? And he was told it would take $500 million and at least 5 years. And he reached out to an Israeli engineer working at one of the aerospace companies who had a dual passport. And this engineer said to him, I can get you good prototypes in 6 months for $10 million. So Jim Wolseley calls Charlie Wilson, as in Charlie Wilson's law, as in Charlie Wilson's war, and he says, can you get the House Appropriations Committee to find $10 million? And that was the beginning of Raptor and Predator. If you look at half the engineers who were working at Intel developing its leading chips, they were dual passport holders, Israeli and American. I go to Beijing, people ask me, have you ever met the Israeli ambassador? Have you met this person? Have you met that person? There are so many Israelis being courted by Beijing to compensate. At the same time, you know, you see the Trump administration trying to cut off funding for some of the most important crown jewels of the US, like Rockefeller University, and the welcome mat is no longer there for many students who would have, you know, who would have killed to come to the US. So in a way, you know, I think Trump is handicapping the US by many of these measures. And, you know, people have fought so hard to save the funding for these brilliant universities, you know, like Rockefeller University. But the fact that the US is no longer the first choice for many of the best and brightest in the rest of the world is one of the major reasons to be pessimistic.
Is that okay? With Professor John,
No.
there are two
You can
professors
disagree.
waiting, so we have to move on. By the way, Chatham House rule is not applied here, but what you said should be fine, right? I
Yes.
thought you were saying something intelligent that may go beyond what.
No, I have
that
no
should be
problems
fine.
with
Okay.
it, yeah.
All right, and just to make sure.
Yeah.
Professor Kim, you wanted to? Yes.
Well, I had two questions. Question one, yeah, it's like your title, China will prove its best friend to the U.S. in the long term. But the question is, how long period you have in mind? Like 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years? I really want to. I hope that China and the U.S. be good friends. End up being good friends for the whole world. But I really wonder when that's going to be. 10 years, 20 years. And the second question is, as an economics professor, I never encountered a trade model showing the success, telling the success stories, trading between the U.S. and China. China is a communist country, where capital mobility and the labor mobility are restricted, whereas the U.S. has the almost perfect mobility in resources, labor as well as capital. So as the two countries compete and trade with each other, it's inevitable for people to see and observe so many conflicts and problems. So it's not, strange and weird for the two nation leaders argue or discuss or fight with each other. So I wonder you have heard any story about this, and there's no trade model in the textbook, where the communist or the socialist countries and the capitalist countries trade with each other successfully.
I fundamentally don't see this just about trade. I don't know if you've read Graham Allison's book, in which he talks about the Thucydides trap and how almost inevitably the handoff between the rising power and the declining power is not a peaceful one. And one of the few exceptions to that is sort of the rise of the US and the decline of Britain between the two world wars. I think it's much more about technological leadership, and it's not fundamentally all of that ideological. I think it's just about the fact that a resurgent China is challenging the US for technological supremacy. I also believe that actually the United States changed fundamentally as a result of September 11th and then the response and the global financial crisis afterwards, and became much more prone to fear-mongering. And so I don't see this just about trade, and I don't see that President Trump's response is particularly productive. So he can tell Ford Motor Company, you cannot open a plant in Mexico, you have to put that plant in Michigan. But I think in 10 years, that plant will shut anyway. So I see this less about ideology and more about rising power and declining power. And that, of course, makes it very difficult for China's neighbors, because economics says, shouldn't you do more business with the rising power? But your security is tied to the declining power, and yet you don't have a very reliable ally, and this creates a really messy situation for countries like yours. So you have my sympathy, but I do think it's, it is about the Thucydides trap, and I think even some of the most impressive generals, who are retired and now are at universities, believe this as well.
Okay. One last question, Mr. Professor Kim.
Jung Kim from Yonsei University. You did not mention about China's capital market.
I can talk about that if you'd like.
China's capital market is a very hot issue between the United States and China. And when the China opened its capital market, China could experience the currency crisis like Korea. What is your prospect of the China's capital market opening?
Well, it's a very interesting subject, and thank you for bringing it up. You know, the Chinese have slowed the liberalization of the renminbi, but, you know, because they're so alarmed at this prospect. And I asked one of the professors in Hong Kong, if there were no capital controls, where would the renminbi go? And he said 15 to the dollar. But China, the one thing that to me unites the whole world outside the US, where the world is definitely in sympathy with China, is that I think most countries in the world believe that the US dollar as the only reserve currency is not an ideal situation. And many people resent the US taking advantage of its status to punish and extort. So, for example, if you look at the French banks, you know, Paribas paying $10 billion in fines, you know, SocGen paying at least 5, Deutsche Bank paying at least 5. You know, they extort money from banks and from countries using that status. And the lawyers at Stand Chart and the executives of Stand Chart told me that they wanted to plead not guilty to the charges of money laundering, etc. But their lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell said, we can't let you do this, because if you lose, you will be shut out of the US payment system. If you're shut out of the US payment system, you're out of business. So, you know, the US uses this. So Mitsubishi Bank was being accused of insufficient controls about money laundering by the Fed at the time of the crisis. China's CIC wanted to invest in Morgan Stanley, which was on the verge of going bust. The Fed said to Mitsubishi, we will drop all these charges, potential charges of money laundering, if you invest in Morgan Stanley. 2 days after that deal was announced, the charges went away. So the US uses that status, and China eventually will be the only successful alternative. You know, I was talking to former Prime Minister Villon of France about how much Europe resents US sanctions that are being imposed on Iran. But no French company dares do business in Iran for fear that they will be shut out of the US payment system. So we're at a very messy point. But, you know, you're so right about where capital markets go. Foreigners are incredibly underinvested in China today. So foreigners have about 2%, both of the equity markets in China and the bond markets, while China is already the third biggest bond market in the world. So if foreign investors were invested in China to the extent that they should be given their weight, they would be 11% of the equity market rather than 2% and 18% of the bond market. There still isn't this trust. You know, many people, since, you know, when the Chinese were so heavy-handed, you know, in their intervention in 2015, it scared many foreigners away. China has actually not learned the lesson of 2015. So a few months ago, they were planning to do CDRs, right, Chinese depository receipts, so Chinese could access their own companies that are listed abroad. So they went around to 6 of the major asset managers in China and said, please raise $5 billion in funds to support this new CDR market. But the sentiment was terrible in June. The only way they could raise the funds was to sell existing holdings, and the market went down more. So you see all of these counterproductive things. But will China get there eventually? I hope and believe it will. So many people have talked about the rising default rate in corporate China. To me, that's a good thing. You know, Guo Shuqing, who now runs the banking and insurance regulator, has said many times, we will not support every company in China. There will be defaults. We will let the markets determine the fate more of companies. But, you know, he is encountering problems from Beijing. You know, we've just seen a new head of the CSRC, the securities regulator, you know, and the securities regulator is much more concerned with pleasing Beijing than completing the market. So it's a very messy time. Long answer, but thank you so much for the question.
I think we have to stop here, although we can continue with such an interesting question from the floor and excellent responses from Henny. And I'm afraid she may lose her flight to Hong Kong if we continue our dialogue this way. Well, thank you very much once again for the brilliant speech and follow this morning.
Thank you for giving me an excuse
Thank you
to be here.
very much.
Thank you all